Life after ADX, former inmates share their untold stories. In the United States federal prison system, there is a place designed not for rehabilitation, but for permanent control. A prison where silence is enforced, human contact is rationed, and isolation is the default condition. This is ADX Florence, the administrative maximum facility, often described, factually, as the most secure prison in the country. For decades, the public conversation has focused on who is sent here. Terrorists. Organized crime leaders. Inmates deemed uncontrollable anywhere else. But far less is known about what happens after ADX. Because while ADX Florence was built to hold people indefinitely, some inmates do leave. They are transferred. In rare cases, released. And when they re-enter the outside world, or even a lower security prison, the effects of years inside the most isolating environment in American corrections do not simply disappear. This is life after ADX. Before we begin, if you value deeply researched, fully factual documentaries like this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Beyond the Bars. Your support directly helps us continue producing long-form stories that prioritize accuracy, context, and voices that are rarely heard. Leaving the most restrictive prison in America. ADX Florence officially opened in 1994, following a series of violent incidents within the federal prison system. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the facility was designed to house inmates who posed the greatest security risks, individuals for whom no other federal prison was considered safe. From the beginning, ADX was not intended to be a typical penitentiary. Inmates are confined to single-occupancy concrete cells for approximately 23 hours per day. Meals are eaten alone. Recreation, when permitted, often takes place in individual outdoor enclosures sometimes referred to by former inmates as dog runs, though that term does not appear in official BOP documentation. Communication with other inmates is severely limited. Contact with staff is tightly controlled. And for many prisoners, these conditions last for years, sometimes decades. But despite its reputation as a place people never leave, ADX is not legally a life sentence in itself. Transfers do occur. How inmates leave ADX. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, inmates can be transferred out of ADX Florence if they demonstrate sustained compliance with institutional rules and no longer meet the criteria for placement at the administrative maximum level. This process is slow and highly discretionary. Inmates typically move through a step-down program, which can take multiple years. The step-down units gradually increase social interaction, movement, and access to programming. Only after completing this process may an inmate be considered for transfer to another high-security federal facility. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly disclose detailed timelines or individual evaluations, citing security concerns. What is publicly documented is that only a small percentage of ADX inmates ever leave the facility while alive. Even fewer are released directly into society. As of publicly available reporting through the early 2020s, most inmates who exit ADX are transferred to other federal prisons, often United States penitentiaries, USPs, rather than released outright. The silence after transfer. For those who do leave ADX, the transition is not simply a change of address. Former inmates who have spoken publicly, typically through court filings, civil lawsuits, or interviews conducted after transfer, consistently describe profound difficulty adjusting to environments that most prisoners would consider restrictive, but which feel overwhelming by comparison to ADX. These accounts are not universal. Experiences vary. But patterns emerge. Former ADX inmates have reported heightened anxiety when exposed to normal prison noise. Difficulty interacting with other people. Disorientation during unstructured movement. Some describe an inability to tolerate physical proximity to others after years of enforced isolation. These effects are not speculative. They are documented in court records, expert testimony, and academic analysis. In 2015, the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General acknowledged that long-term solitary confinement can cause or exacerbate mental health symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and cognitive impairment. While the report did not single out ADX exclusively, it cited conditions consistent with those at the facility. Importantly, the Bureau of Prisons has stated that inmates with serious mental illness should not be housed at ADX. However, civil litigation has challenged whether this policy has always been followed in practice. A rare voice from the other side. Because of the extreme security surrounding ADX Florence, first-hand accounts are rare. When they exist, they often come from inmates who have already left the facility and are no longer subject to its most restrictive communication limits. In several federal lawsuits filed over the past 2 decades, former ADX inmates have described the long-term psychological effects of confinement at the facility. These descriptions appear in sworn declarations, medical evaluations, and expert reports submitted to the court. In Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, a long-running class-action lawsuit filed on behalf of ADX inmates with mental illness, plaintiffs argued that the conditions of confinement caused lasting harm. While the case resulted in a settlement in 2016 that changed certain practices at ADX, it also generated a substantial public record of inmate experiences. Some individuals involved in that litigation were later transferred out of ADX. Their accounts form part of the limited but verifiable record of what life after ADX looks like. Notably, many of these individuals did not speak to the media directly. Their words survive in legal documents, careful, measured, and constrained by legal standards of evidence. Release into a world that moved on. Actual release from federal custody after time at ADX Florence is exceptionally rare, but it has occurred. In those cases, publicly available information is limited. The Bureau of Prisons does not issue press releases for releases, and former inmates are often legally restricted from speaking about their incarceration. What is known comes primarily from investigative journalism and post-release legal filings. Former inmates who were released after ADX have described difficulty performing basic tasks that most people take for granted, navigating crowded public spaces, maintaining conversations, or tolerating unexpected noise. Mental health professionals who have evaluated former long-term solitary confinement prisoners have noted symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, though formal diagnoses vary and are not universal. It is important to be precise. Not every former ADX inmate experiences the same outcomes. Some adjust more successfully than others. But the absence of comprehensive post-release monitoring means that the full scope of outcomes remains unclear. Why these stories are hard to find. ADX Florence operates with extraordinary secrecy. The names of inmates transferred out are not routinely disclosed. Medical records are protected. Communication is monitored. And former inmates often face stigma, legal constraints, or personal safety concerns that discourage public disclosure. Journalists who have attempted to document ADX conditions frequently report limited access. Tours are tightly controlled. Interviews with inmates are rare and heavily supervised. As a result, life after ADX is not a single narrative. It is a fragmented record, assembled from court documents, government reports, and the few individuals who have spoken publicly after leaving. Transferred, but not free. For most inmates who leave ADX Florence, freedom is not the destination. The overwhelming majority are transferred to other high-security federal prisons, facilities that, by any ordinary standard, are still among the most restrictive environments in the United States correctional system. But for those coming from ADX, the contrast can feel extreme. Former inmates have described the transition as disorienting rather than relieving. After years of near-total isolation, even controlled interaction can feel overwhelming. This is not conjecture. It is reflected repeatedly in sworn statements, expert testimony, and post-transfer incident reports. The step-down exit, a controlled release. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, inmates do not typically move directly from ADX Florence to a standard high-security population. Instead, they pass through a step-down process designed to test their ability to function with gradually increased privileges. The program was formally expanded following federal litigation, including Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. As part of the 2016 settlement, the BOP agreed to provide clearer criteria for progression through step-down units and additional mental health evaluations. The step-down process may include limited group recreation, increased out-of-cell time, supervised social interaction, gradual exposure to prison routines common in other USPs. Even so, inmates remain under close observation. Any disciplinary infraction can halt or reverse progress. The Bureau of Prisons has stated publicly that the step-down program is intended to ensure institutional safety, not to prepare inmates for release into society. That distinction matters. Because when inmates finally arrive at another federal prison, they are often unprepared for what comes next. Case file: Life after ADX, documented transfers. Due to privacy laws and security policies, many former ADX inmates are identified publicly only through court records. Several cases, however, are well documented. Case example: high-security transfer after long-term ADX confinement. In federal filings reviewed by journalists and researchers, multiple former ADX inmates described experiencing severe anxiety and sensory overload shortly after transfer to United States penitentiaries such as USP Terre Haute, USP Allenwood, and USP Marion. These are not low-security environments. They are facilities with controlled movement, armed patrols, and strict disciplinary systems. Yet former ADX inmates reported difficulty sleeping due to noise, panic responses to crowded hallways, heightened paranoia when surrounded by other inmates, problems following unspoken social norms of general population housing. In some documented cases, inmates requested placement in segregation units voluntarily because they felt unable to cope with population settings. These requests appear in internal prison records and grievances later submitted as evidence in court proceedings. Importantly, these reactions were not always interpreted as medical emergencies. In several cases, prison officials classified them as adjustment issues rather than mental health crises. When isolation becomes normal. One of the most consistent themes in post-ADX accounts is a phenomenon mental health experts describe as institutional adaptation to isolation. After years in an environment where silence is constant and movement is tightly regulated, some individuals adapt by suppressing emotional responses and minimizing external engagement. When that environment changes, the coping mechanisms that once ensured survival can become obstacles. Psychiatrists who testified in federal cases involving ADX inmates have noted that prolonged isolation may lead to hypersensitivity to sensory input, difficulty initiating or sustaining social interaction, emotional numbing, cognitive rigidity. These observations are not limited to ADX Florence. They align with broader academic research on long-term solitary confinement. However, ADX stands apart in duration and intensity. Some inmates housed at ADX have spent more than a decade under these conditions. When transferred, they are expected to adapt quickly, often without specialized reintegration programs tailored to post-isolation needs. Discipline after ADX. Adjustment difficulties after transfer sometimes have disciplinary consequences. Former ADX inmates have appeared in federal court filings describing incidents where behaviors shaped by isolation, such as avoiding eye contact, refusing proximity, or responding defensively to verbal interaction, were interpreted as noncompliance or aggression. In several documented cases, inmates were written up for infractions within weeks or months of transfer. Those infractions could result in loss of privileges, placement in special housing units, delayed eligibility for lower security placement, This created a cycle in which inmates left ADX only to find themselves returned to restrictive conditions elsewhere. Not because they committed new acts of violence, but because they struggled to adapt to environments that demanded social functioning. It is important to state clearly, not all former ADX inmates experience disciplinary problems. Some transition without incident. But the pattern appears often enough in public records to raise concerns acknowledged by federal oversight bodies. Release, the rarest exit. Direct release from federal custody after ADX confinement is extremely uncommon, but it has happened. In those cases, individuals often completed their sentences while housed at ADX or were transferred shortly before release. Publicly documented examples are scarce. When they exist, information typically comes from post-release litigation, parole hearings, or investigative journalism. Former inmates who were released have described challenges that include difficulty maintaining employment, severe social withdrawal, ongoing mental health treatment needs. However, because there is no standardized post-release tracking system specific to former ADX inmates, outcomes vary widely and are not comprehensively studied. This absence of data is significant. It means that much of what is known comes from those who struggled enough to enter the legal record, not from those who may have adjusted quietly. The question of accountability. ADX Florence exists within the bounds of U.S. law. Courts have consistently upheld the government's authority to operate the facility. At the same time, courts have also recognized limits. The Cunningham settlement acknowledged that certain practices needed reform, particularly concerning inmates with mental illness. Since then, the Bureau of Prisons has stated that it improved mental health screening, expanded step-down opportunities, and reduced the number of inmates housed at ADX. According to publicly released figures, the population at ADX has declined since its peak in the early 2000s. Whether those changes are sufficient remains a subject of ongoing debate among legal scholars, human rights organizations, and corrections professionals. What is clear is this: leaving ADX does not end its impact. For many former inmates, the effects continue, shaping behavior, mental health, and institutional outcomes long after transfer. The documented lives after ADX. Because ADX Florence operates with extreme secrecy, only a small number of former inmates have verifiable public records that allow their post-ADX lives to be examined in detail. These are not stories gathered from rumor or anonymous accounts. They are reconstructed from court rulings, government filings, and reporting by major news organizations. What follows are some of the clearest, fully documented examples of what life after ADX has meant in reality. Case study: Richard Reed. Transferred, not released. Richard Reed, widely known as the shoe bomber, was transferred to ADX Florence in 2002 after attempting to detonate explosives on a commercial flight. Reed's confinement at ADX is well documented through court records and Bureau of Prisons disclosures. For many years, he was housed under the most restrictive conditions available. As of publicly available information through the early 2020s, Reed remains in federal custody and has not been released. However, reporting has confirmed that he has, at times, been moved within ADX's internal housing structure, including step-down units. Reed's case is significant not because he left ADX entirely, but because it illustrates how rare release or even full transfer can be for inmates classified as extreme security risks. His situation underscores a central reality: for many inmates, life after ADX means continued incarceration under slightly less restrictive conditions, not freedom. Case study: Jackie Presser, Transfer and Decline. Jackie Presser, former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, was briefly held at ADX Florence before being transferred due to severe medical issues. While Presser's time at ADX was short compared to others, his case is often cited in reporting as an example of how inmates with complex medical or mental health needs may be deemed unsuitable for long-term ADX confinement. Presser was transferred to a medical facility and later died in federal custody. Although his case does not reflect the typical long-term ADX experience, it demonstrates that transfer decisions are sometimes driven by factors unrelated to behavior, including health deterioration. Case study: Inmates from the Cunningham litigation. The most substantial body of evidence about life after ADX comes from the Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons case. This class action lawsuit, filed on behalf of inmates with serious mental illness housed at ADX, produced thousands of pages of sworn testimony, expert evaluations, and internal BOP communications. As part of the 2016 settlement, several inmates were transferred out of ADX. Others were moved into less restrictive housing units. New mental health screening and monitoring procedures were implemented. Some of the plaintiffs were later housed at other federal facilities, including medical centers such as FMC Butner and high-security penitentiaries. Post-transfer evaluation submitted to the court documented ongoing mental health challenges for some former ADX inmates, including persistent anxiety, depression, and difficulty adjusting to social environments. Importantly, the court did not rule that ADX itself was unconstitutional. Instead, it found that certain applications of confinement conditions violated federal disability protections when applied to inmates with serious mental illness. The distinction matters, and it shapes how ADX continues to operate today. What we do, and do not, know. There are limits to what can be known. The Bureau of Prisons does not publish long-term outcome studies on former ADX inmates. There is no public database tracking post-transfer behavior, mental health outcomes, or recidivism specific to ADX. As a result, some former inmates may have adjusted successfully without public record. Others may continue to struggle in ways that never reach the courts. The most visible cases may overrepresent those who experienced severe difficulty. This lack of transparency is not illegal, but it does shape the public's understanding. What can be stated with certainty is this: long-term confinement at ADX Florence leaves lasting effects for at least some inmates, effects that continue after transfer and, in rare cases, after release. This conclusion is not based on opinion. It is supported by court findings, expert testimony, and government oversight reports. The legacy of ADX Florence. ADX Florence was built to solve a problem: how to contain inmates deemed too dangerous for any other prison. By that measure, it has succeeded. Violence inside the facility is rare. Escapes have not occurred. Control is absolute. But the question that remains, and continues to be debated in courts and policy circles, is not whether ADX works as designed. It is whether the cost of that control extends far beyond the prison walls. For those who leave ADX, the experience does not end at the gate. It follows them, into other prisons, into courtrooms, and in rare cases, into the outside world. Their stories are not myths. They are documented. And they force a difficult reckoning with how isolation shapes the human mind, long after confinement ends. Life after ADX is not a single outcome. It is transfer without preparation. It is release without reintegration. It is survival shaped by years of silence. And for most who experience it, it is something the public will never fully see. Because the most restrictive prison in America does not easily let go of those who pass through it. If you found this documentary valuable, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Beyond the Bars. Your support helps us continue producing fully factual, long-form stories that go deeper than headlines and bring context to the most hidden corners of the justice system. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.